I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I'm back into the pattern of the phase of my life where I count episodes, so I'm going to go ahead and say episode 153. Been a while we've been doing this, Pat.
Been 153, man. That we have been doing this for a while.
I know, 153 episodes, and what a great way to celebrate our 153rd week-iversary. Approximately. Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Johnson 2 is taking place this weekend as the main event of UFC 210. And quite honestly, I'm looking forward to the entirety of UFC 210. Feeling good, feeling hyped up. We have 4 big fights that we're going to discuss today. We've got Cormier Johnson 2, of course, as noted. We also have a middleweight contest between Chris Weidman and Gegard Mousasi. Very excited for that one. We have former Bellator champion Will Brooks trying to get back on track with a fight against Charles Oliveira, who, by the way, should get as much hate as John Lineker does for missing weight, because I did not realize until recently this dude has missed the featherweight limit 4 times. But fortunately, this Oliveira will be pushed up to lightweight rather than the last Oliveira Brooks fought, who really should have been a large welterweight. And then finally, we have a very exciting welterweight sort of prospect matchup between Kamaru Usman and Sean Strickland, which I think is kind of sneakily one of the best fights on this card, one of the most interesting ones. So we have a lot of great fights to talk about. Before we dive in, let's get some pleasantries out, Pat. How you doing?
Doing pretty dang well.
Feeling good? Weather nice out there in California?
Oh, it's beautiful, man. It's all the way up in the 70s. Like, it is absolutely lovely. Can't complain about any of it. No case of the Mondays on this end, Connor.
Feeling extremely hyped. You seem extremely excited. Very, very chipper, very good mood. I too am feeling good. Got back to the boxing gym last week for the first time in ages. Got my copious ass back in the gym. Felt real tired.
Your copious ass. That is a great turn of phrase, by the way.
Soon, I think I'm feeling good. Going to go back today after we record. I think I will very soon be challenging the winner of Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Johnson too. So,
sounds good to me. I would watch.
On my way to the belt. Let's go ahead and dive in without further ado. Daniel Cormier, Anthony Johnson, these two fought once before, of course. I think back in 2014. They met.
May 2015, UFC 187.
There we go. 2015, 187 for the vacant light heavyweight belt after it was stripped from John Jones for his, which offense was it that caused John Jones to be stripped?
That was the hit and run.
Okay, there we go. So one of many strange things in the strange, twisted life of John Jones. But Daniel Cormier, in the absence of John Jones, I think undeniably deserves to be called the best light heavyweight in the world. He is a phenomenal fighter, and I honestly don't think he gets enough respect for how good he is. Then again, neither does Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson is certainly perhaps feared more than Daniel Cormier. But remember, Daniel Cormier, the best light heavyweight in the world aside from John Jones, is the only man in the UFC since Johnson's return in 2014 to have made him look even slightly mortal. So we have a fantastic rematch here. Johnson managed to hurt Cormier last time. Cormier managed to gut it out and out-wrestle Johnson. What do you make of this matchup in broad strokes?
Well, it's a really, really interesting one because I think both guys are at heart at this point in their careers. They like to pressure. They like to get after their opponent. Yep. And so that played to Cormier's advantage in their first fight because as long as he could weather the storm, as long as he could deal with Johnson's forward movement and his aggression, then that was going to bring Johnson into Cormier's wheelhouse, right? Johnson very famously overextended and gave up takedowns, gave up clinch control, and just kind of got ground down while still doing tremendous amounts of damage to Cormier. Mm-hmm. So basically, to me, I think it's a given that Cormier is going to try to pressure. That means that there are 2 different approaches that Johnson can take, though. Either he could try to play to his strengths and meet pressure with pressure, or he can try to fight against type and try to stick and move and make Cormier work for it, make Cormier come forward. I actually think the former is probably the better approach for him. I think it's probably better to try to make this a firefight but a more measured one, something more like what he did to Phil Davis instead of just like throwing bungalows as soon as Cormier stepped into range.
Right. The problem for him last time, right? Everyone remembers he knocked Cormier down about 30 seconds into the fight. God help Daniel Cormier, by the way, if he pokes Anthony Johnson in the eye, because we know Anthony Johnson's eyes are magnets for the fingertips of his opponents, but more often than not, an eye poke is usually followed these days by a swift retribution. That was the case in the last fight. Short little eye poke. Johnson said he was fine. Very quickly knocked Cormier down with a thunderous right hand. But got over aggressive, got wild, really seemed, and it seemed that as Cormier showed that he was not only able to survive, but to come back and to pressure and to grind on Johnson. There we go. To grind on Rumble, we'll say. That seemed to intensify the sort of desperation that Anthony felt in trying to land his shots, so that more and more as the fight went on, whenever he had space, he would go crazy trying to land huge kicks, huge thunderous bombs, both hands swinging, and allowed Cormier, who's kind of weird technically, doesn't have like great head movement or anything, but is willing to move and evade and keep his hands up and slip in underneath shots. It afforded him a lot of opportunities to get back in on Rumble's hips. And so I agree with you. I think if Johnson is smart in this fight, what we will see is pressure, but measured pressure. I think he doesn't want to let Cormier push him back into the fence, but he also doesn't want to go swinging crazily with overhands. And on a more tactical level, I think it would be really nice if we could see some uppercuts from Anthony Johnson, because really the big problem for him in the first fight was having his overhands countered by shot singles. And if he does not offer an upward threat to Daniel Cormier, I can definitely see the same thing happening again.
Yeah, he needs to make Cormier stand up.
Yeah.
Right? And there are a couple of ways to do that. I think uppercuts are one, head kicks are another. Like, I thought that was a smart piece of Johnson's strategy. Was he did use in their first fight briefly head kicks to stand Cormier up, caught him with a couple flush. So that, I mean, in that sense, this fight is kind of a gamble, right? That it is a given that Cormier is going to eat some big shots. Yeah. The question is, can he eat those shots on the way in as he tries to impose his preferred game, right? Like, and I think there's a real question as to whether that's the case. Like, Cormier is obviously super tough. He's never been knocked out, but he's also been knocked down in 2 of his last 3 fights. Yeah. And he's 38. He's taken a lot of shots. He's been through a lot of really vicious sparring sessions at AKA. Can his chin handle Anthony Johnson's bombs, especially a more measured Johnson that's not going to give him as many clean shots underneath?
Will Johnson be more measured, though? That is the question. I would like to say yes. I think we've seen a few good things from him in recent performances, but again, we saw a lot of the same things from him before he fought Cormier. I'm going to hot take you now. I think Daniel Cormier might be the worst matchup in the light heavyweight division for Anthony Johnson. I think he might be a substantially harder matchup than John Jones, because Cormier is real scrappy, and he will force the clinch, and he will force the wrestling game whenever somebody presses him or whenever he gets to press somebody else. You give Daniel Cormier an opportunity to attack your hips, he's going to do it. Whereas John Jones, I was talking about this recently with the always insightful Phil McKenzie, and Phil was saying something that I thought was very salient. He was saying that John Jones really doesn't make his game happen a lot. It's maybe the defensive mindset that a lot of champions take on, but it's kind of like his opponents either come after him and get into the clinch, or he picks them apart on the way in. And when they choose to sort of hang out at range and strike with him, either at long range or mid range, that is when he often looks kind of lackluster. We saw that in the Gustafsson fight. I think that would probably be the case were Jones to fight Anthony Johnson. I don't think he would be able to wrestle him as aggressively as Cormier can. And so I think that while Anthony Johnson losing to Cormier is certainly not a foregone conclusion, I think he has every chance of beating him this Saturday. Cormier's grittiness, his willingness to wrestle, to make things dirty, his willingness to pressure, really just to do whatever it takes, combined, of course, with his tremendous wrestling skill, might make him the toughest matchup in the division for Rumble.
Yeah, but I still think Jon Jones would beat Rumble. Like the Cormier may be a tougher stylistic matchup, but Jon Jones is Jon Jones, and there's a reason why Jon Jones is Jon Jones. You know, like, I understand what you're saying, but I also think that Jon Jones manages to find ways to make things happen because he's a genius and because he adapts exceptionally well. Like, Jon Jones's game plan is always flexible enough. It's flow charty enough to allow for different things. And if you think that Daniel Cormier can allow Rumble to overextend and get inside and get into the clinch, Jon Jones can do that better than Daniel Cormier can. Jon Jones is a master of letting you come too far in, of forcing you to walk that tightrope between long range and the clinch where he is most dangerous.
Yeah.
Like, if Rumble came forward against Jon Jones would grab the clinch, and Jon Jones would probably get hit some amount as he was forcing him to do that. But Jones is a better clinch fighter than Daniel Cormier. He's a more stifling clinch fighter. He's a much more dangerous one who can do a lot more damage and is much more attritive than Daniel Cormier is in the clinch. So I understand your point. I think you're not quite giving Jon Jones enough credit as an active for the threat of Jon Jones's clinch game and his ability to impose that when he sees fit.
I really hope we get to talk about it more in depth someday soon. I really, really hope that Jones and Rumble meet before long.
I'm genuinely not counting on ever seeing Jon Jones fight in a cage again. I can't let myself get my hopes up until I actually see him in the cage.
Can't let your heart get broken again, right? It's just, you got to protect yourself, right? It's just self-interest. That's what you got to think about. Okay, well, yeah. So the thing I want to talk about is, right, whether it's Jon Jones or Daniel Cormier, we both kind of agree that, like, weathering the storm is pretty much a thing you have to do if you're fighting Anthony Johnson. You're going to take some shots early. You said before, basically, that that's what Daniel Cormier is going to have to do. Why on a technical level, does it seem always so obvious that Anthony Johnson is going to score some big punches and kicks early? Why is he so effective? Why do we both agree that Daniel Cormier cannot possibly escape the first round of this fight without taking some heavy shots?
Because Rumble is an exceptional counterpuncher. I think he may be one of the best counterpunchers in all of MMA. He's up there in the top 5, I think, with Chris Cyborg, Conor McGregor, Jose Aldo, fighters on that level. That's the level of counterpuncher that Anthony Johnson is. He is so good at it. But that's kind of the problem. Like, you can't, if you're Daniel Cormier, just walk into the pocket with him and expect that to work. Cormier is much better defensively than he used to be. He's better defensively than he was the first time these two guys fought. Like, you can see him move his head more. His hands are more active. He doesn't take as many flush shots, but simply by virtue of the fact that he is constantly there to be hit, which is a function of both his forward movement and his short stature. Like, he's got an extra 4 or 5 inches of distance where he can be hit. Just because of that it creates opportunities for his opponent to hit him, and he's not so clean defensively that he doesn't get hit as he moves in. And Rumble is really, really, really good at keying off your aggression and forcing you to eat shots. Like, he's also brilliant at shot selection, at picking and choosing the correct shots, at firing under your gloves, around your gloves, straight through your guard if you get a little bit sloppy with a double forearms guard. Like, he is brilliant at it. He has incredible timing too. Like, I was rewatching the Manoa fight yesterday, and I was just struck by every single time Manoa threw, Rumble had a counter. Every single time.
Yeah, and frequently more than one. I mean, frequently when he would knock Manoa down, there would be 2 or 3 punches coming right after it that he had already had in the chamber.
Yeah, like, he is a brilliant counterpuncher, absolutely exceptional. And to me, like, Cormier has made improvements. He's become a more comfortable pressure fighter. He's better defensively than he was. I think he's better at using his takedown game. I think his pure takedowns are maybe a little bit better than they were. But the basic dynamic of that matchup hasn't changed that much. Or if anything, I think that Rumble is maybe a little bit better at the things that Rumble really wants to do.
Right. So what we would kind of hope to see then, maybe for a good chance of Johnson not just getting those big moments early, but winning rounds, at least up to the point that he could maybe score a knockout. Or if not, Cormier is still very tough, even though he's been dropped a few times in recent fights. Johnson may have to win, 3 of 5 rounds to do that, I would think that I'd want to see him pressure, but sort of play an aggressive counterpunching game. I think what got him into a lot of hot water last time is that he was either reacting with lots of offense at once to Cormier's pressure, or he was pressuring him recklessly. And it's kind of a weird thing with Rumble, where you have a fighter who, as you said, has phenomenal shot selection, but in many ways can lack discipline, where even when Anthony Johnson is being way too aggressive, when he's being undisciplined, the shot selection's still there. You know, what he's throwing, how he puts his strikes together still makes sense. How he moves off of them, his feel for fighting does not go away. But the strategy that he should be sticking to vanishes a little too easily for a guy who's going to be facing a really dogged fighter like Cormier. It leaves a lot of opportunities for someone like Cormier, who, I mean, nobody but John Jones has ever really broken Cormier's game plan. You know what I mean? Has ever really thrown Daniel Cormier off of the idea he had in his head when he first stepped into the octagon. And John Jones kind of had to exhaust him first and force Cormier into like this moral battle of getting a moral takedown victory in the 5th round. But even then, Cormier's still pressing, still looking to get some kind of victory, and not going crazy to do so. And I think that Johnson, we've seen a lot of things throughout Rumble's career, right, where he's kind of a little infamous for fading and getting rear naked choked. And I think it's unfair to paint him as a fighter who just breaks, but
he's the clearest example of a fighter who just breaks. There is literally no better example. Like, there are a lot of fighters to whom that gets applied unfairly. Rumble is not one of them. 4 of his 5 losses are by rear naked choke. The other one was that weird eye poke thing against Kevin Burns. Mm-hmm. The rear and all of those losses follow exactly the same pattern. He's in control. He does a ton of damage. Maybe knocks his opponent down. Maybe comes close to getting a finish, and then gets tired, loses the initiative. Gets tired, and then gives up his back and gets choked out.
Yeah, I think losing the initiative.
It's the same pattern.
Yeah.
In all of them.
Yeah, it's like shockingly, whether it's Josh Koscheck or Daniel Cormier. That's the crazy thing, is that it's happened across this huge scope of weight classes and opponents. It's Vitor Belfort.
It happened the first time 10 years ago against Rich Clemente.
Yeah, and it hasn't gone away. I mean, he has undeniably gotten better, which is why I say I don't want to paint him as a guy who just breaks. That's not all he does. But when he breaks, it's like he just breaks. It just happens. And I think losing the initiative, I think that's a really good point. I think that's typically what leads to it. Anthony Johnson feels that he is no longer in control, that he has to either prove something, or that he rather than feeling free to find a big moment in the fight, or to create a big moment, he starts feeling like he has to, and then he loses his edge. You know, he starts getting crazy, or he starts really noticing how tired he is, or whatever. The discipline goes away. And that's an opportunity for Daniel Cormier, especially because Cormier, as you just said, has become so much better as a takedown artist since coming to light heavyweight. He was always, of course, a great wrestler, but Daniel Cormier has really honed his aggressive wrestling game in the light heavyweight division. And I want to talk about the way he got takedowns on Anthony Johnson in their first fight, because it's not like Daniel Cormier is getting a huge shot and taking Johnson off of his feet. All he needs is to get some sort of body contact. You know, we talk about angles a lot with takedown defense, and we talk about angles as they pertain to setting up shot takedowns from relatively long distance. Daniel Cormier is an amazing study for how useful angles are when you've already got a hold of your opponent. Daniel Cormier is always latching onto a leg, getting a body lock, and always working his way toward a side, working his way to the back. The way he sets up that high crotch lift is beautiful, and he almost does it the same way every single time. He'll get a single leg, he gets into a clinch, he gets a nice head position, and then he will tug his opponent's balance away, and as he does it, he'll skirt around to the side, and as they recover, now he's in a position where he has a leverage to lift them. It's beautiful to watch him just get any kind of grip on his opponent, and unless it's John Jones, turn that into a takedown. Even if it takes a lot of work and a lot of adjusting, he does not need to get a quick or easy takedown to get you to the ground.
That's because in his actual wrestling career up until 2008, Daniel Cormier was kind of a conservative counter wrestler. Like, he was not really an aggressive get after you kind of takedown artist. He liked to let you make the first move and then counter off of that. So he has one of the best go behinds. Like, that is his signature move.
He was still using angles inside, just in a different sort of strategy.
Yeah, it was a more conservative approach. I think in large part too because he used to cut so much weight.
Yeah.
That energy was never his strong suit. Like, he was not an endless gas tank kind of wrestler. And so I don't know. I feel like he just had that kind of conservative approach, and it didn't necessarily mesh well with what he was doing in MMA until he started to apply more pressure. Like, we would see flashes of that takedown game, right? Like the huge lift and slam he hit on Josh Barnett. But look at this. Like, so he hit a bunch of takedowns against Josh Barnett, hit a bunch against Dion Starring in that throwaway fight, 0 against Frank Mir, 3 kind of brief takedowns against Roy Nelson, 0 against Patrick Cummins, slammed the shit out of Dan Henderson all over the place. Yeah. But it's only really in like his last, like, since he moved to light heavyweight, that he has really been leaning hard on that takedown game. And I think that you're right. It's because he's finding better setups for it. Like, the angles have always been there, but now he's more consistently in ranges where he can get a hold of his opponent and then start to work that kind of game.
Yeah, and the adjustments inside. Like, I was honestly just watching Cormier Johnson 1 and just marveling at the way that he works to get it. And by the way, Daniel Cormier is a goddamn pit bull. Like, when he gets a grip, he might be one of the hardest guys in the sport of MMA to get to escape when he gets his hands locked around a limb or a waist. He controlled Anthony Johnson, who was standing on both feet with a seatbelt grip for like 2 straight minutes in the first round. He just locked his hands over his neck and under one arm and just held on to him and just bent him over and made him carry his weight. And it's that kind of ability that makes me wonder if Anthony Johnson really needs one big shot. Like, I'm not sure if Anthony Johnson can beat Daniel Cormier absent that one big moment, because to do so would essentially mean reversing a trend that has haunted him for a decade, reversing this tendency to break when the initiative is no longer on his side. So let's do it. Final predictions, right? It's the hardest part. It's still a very hard fight to call. Like, I don't have a clear feeling on who will win, because if we're talking about a puncher's chance, and that's unfair to call it just a puncher's chance, but if we're talking about the chance of landing a stunning knockout blow on a 38-year-old Daniel Cormier, who again has been dropped twice in his last 3 fights, then Anthony Johnson's got the best puncher's chance in the world. The man sets up his shots. He selects them very intelligently. It only took him 30 seconds to send Cormier tumbling to the canvas in their first fight, but the fight feels like a one-sided fight in retrospect, because as soon as Daniel Cormier managed to latch on to Johnson and force him into a wrestling game, to put a little pressure on him, to make him work, to make him uncomfortable, he took over. So it's a tale of 2 fights, right? It may be one of our infamous 2 true outcome fights.
Yeah, that's my read on it. I'm picking Johnson here just because the 2 knockdowns in the last 3 fights thing really worries me for Cormier. And I think if Rumble is any more measured than he was in their first fight, and I think it's going to be hard for him to be any less measured. Like, I thought he really got crazy aggressive. I think a better prepared Rumble, because remember, that fight was on 3 weeks notice. Or 4 weeks notice, right?
That's true.
I think 3 weeks?
Yeah, I believe it was 3 weeks.
Yeah, so on 3 weeks' notice, it was a massively different matchup for Rumble than the one he had been preparing for. A much different style of wrestling. And I think that given more time to prepare, because this is now the second time he's prepared to face Daniel Cormier, I think a better prepared Rumble, a more measured Rumble, one who is markedly, I think, better than the guy than the first time. Like, I think his counters are even sharper than they were at that point.
Yeah.
I think he's going to create more opportunities to land the shot and allow fewer opportunities for Cormier to do the Cormier thing, even if Rumble doesn't try to fight against type and still plays the same kind of aggressive game he's used to. I agree with what you said earlier that like Cormier doesn't get enough respect. He absolutely doesn't. I keep feeling like Rumble is on kind of a different level, and if he can land that shot, I don't think Cormier is getting away this time. So
yeah, and we have to say, like, maybe the 3 weeks notice, the lack of preparation played into it. The last time that Johnson started that trademark downhill tumble against Cormier, it was his fault to start with. It was he got so crazy that he flung himself to his knees as Cormier ducked under a right hand, and so all he may need to do is do what Conor McGregor did the second time around against Nate Diaz and just control himself when he's successful. Because we both agree he's going to be successful in the early portions of this fight. And it wasn't just that Daniel Cormier was there to counter him and was gritty and tough. It was that Johnson overreacted to his own offense, to his own success, and got into his own head. And so if he can hit Daniel Cormier and just let Cormier stand back up and stay patient, the opportunities for Cormier to pressure him may not materialize the way they did in the last fight, where it was this just snowball rolling downhill where the more he missed, the more shots Cormier was able to take, the more he was able to counter with his wrestling, the worse Johnson felt and the worse he looked. So, it's a tough fight to call for me. One more thing, by the way, before we pick. Daniel Cormier said when this rematch was first scheduled that he was going to strike with Anthony Johnson. We're hoping that's a ruse, right?
For Cormier's sake, I hope it's a ruse. But I also think he gets at something important there, which is that you can't just come out and try to wrestle Anthony Johnson.
Oh, no
because
doubt.
We've seen how that goes. Like, you have to strike your way into a position to clinch or wrestle. I think Cormier gets that. I don't think Cormier wants to bang it out in the pocket with Anthony Johnson. If he does, he's a fucking wild man. And if he can make that work for him, more credit to him.
If he even did it and failed, I would have so much respect for him, but it would be the kind of respect I have for like the charge of the light brigade. You know what I mean? I wish it didn't happen for his sake. I'm going to go with Daniel Cormier. I think we are still talking about a very confident, very durable fighter. Being dropped, but always been very hard to finish, and that hasn't changed. And I think part of the reason he's been dropped is he's fighting the most dangerous strikers he's ever faced in his entire career. It's not just a factor of age. And I haven't really seen any huge signs, aside from those knockdowns, that Cormier is slowing down with age or getting worse in any noticeable way. In fact, I think we both agree in a lot of ways his technique is improving. So if I'm banking on Anthony Johnson to land one big shot and just shut Cormier's lights out completely, or to land a shot and pile on without giving Cormier the opportunities he needs to turn the momentum around, I think I have to favor DC. But boy, am I excited to watch it. I mean, it's so fun to discuss, and it'll be hopefully even more fun to witness live. A few more wrinkles than last time, and last time was already a very exciting back and forth fight. So looking forward to that one. UFC 210 main event, Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Johnson. We have split the vote, both of us going for different fighters in our predictions, but both of us anticipating it extremely. Let's take a break. When we come back, middleweights Chris Weidman and Gegard Mousasi, and we may also get into lightweights Will Brooks and Charles Oliveira in this next segment. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's move on. Middleweights, Chris Weidman, Gegard Mousasi. Chris Weidman has not had a good last 15 months or so, Pat. He is on the first two-fight losing streak of his career. In fact, the first losses of any kind of his pro MMA career. Of course, the belated TKO against Luke Rockhold, and then the trademark sudden third-round KO from Yoel Romero It's a far fall from the man who had 2 title defenses under his belt not that long ago. And Gegard Mousasi, kind of the opposite feeling as far as momentum is concerned, career momentum anyway. That Gegard Mousasi had 4 straight wins in 2016, the last 3 of them all being one-sided knockouts. Hasn't been facing Luke Rockhold and Yoel Romero, but he has looked good, and more importantly, he's winning in a way that he didn't used to. Mousasi was often the guy who would get taken down and sort of wait for an opportunity on the ground, or on the feet he could be outpaced and outstruck because he didn't seem to have quite enough urgency. He's always been a good finisher, but against the very elite, he's always seemed to, be very close at least to falling short, just not pushing hard enough. Now we have Gegard Mousasi, who is willing to pressure, willing to kind of get dirty and mix it up with his opponents, and willing to land some surprisingly powerful punches. How do you think that momentum continues in a match against Chris Weidman, who may be feeling more disheartened than ever before?
God, this is a really, really, really compelling fight. Yeah. There are a lot of things here that are kind of hard to figure out how they're going to play out, a lot of X factors. I think the big one, you're right, is Weidman's state of mind. How is he going to react after being first kind of comprehensively beat down by Luke Rockhold after the first round? The second, third, and fourth rounds of that fight were, increasingly devastating and bad. So there was that. But then on the other hand, against Romero, he won a competitive first round, lost a competitive second round, and then got his block absolutely fucking knocked off.
Just about got scalped by a Yoel Romero knee.
Decapitated. His head damn near came off. That's so. You got to kind of wonder, is he and otherwise he's been injured a bunch. He hasn't. How much time has he spent in the gym? You kind of got to wonder, where is his head at? And then you look back at his record, and you're like, well, did he just kind of catch these guys at exactly the right time for him?
Yeah. Because
Machida, so Anderson Silva was pretty elderly when he fought him. He was 38 when he beat him twice. Then he fought Lyoto Machida, who was kind of right at the tail end of his prime, and gutted that out to win 3 rounds. Then he fought a non-TRT Vitor Belfort. Then the first kind of prime elite athlete he fights, he gets beat. Then he gets beat by, the ageless wonder Yoel Romero. I don't know. So I think there's a real question that, if you wanted to look back at Weidman's accomplishments, what, kind of where he's at in his career, what is he doing? Can his body take this anymore? What does he have to offer?
And how much?
There are just a lot of way more questions than you would think you would have about a guy who won the first 13 fights of his career and defended his belt 3 times, actually.
Yeah. But how much? The question is, how much did fortuitous timing play a role in his success? I think it's a very valid point to raise. And we were both hoping, I think, that in working with Mark Henry for about a year before the Yoel Romero fight, that Chris Weidman would come in against Romero, show some marked improvements to his boxing. A year is not a huge amount of time, but Weidman is known as a guy who picks up skills very quickly. He's a guy who in 3 months of submission grappling training was dominating brown belts at Naga, was having a competitive grappling match with, was it Galval?
It wasn't Naga, it was ADCCs.
Sorry, ADCC. And then who did he fight that he was almost guillotined, who was a really good grappler? Andre Galval?
I don't think he almost finished Galval. I actually don't remember. It's been a long time.
He lost a quarterfinal matchup to Andre Galval at the ADCC Submission Wrestling World Championship. Mm-hmm. But he was competitive, surprisingly
he
competitive.
The shit out of him. It was awesome. Galval tried a back take, and Weidman just hip tossed the shit out of him,
right.
Slammed him onto the mat. You could see the talent. It was pretty clear how talented he was.
And on the ground, that talent is still there. Chris Weidman really is a phenomenal grappler. He's been a so-so wrestler, I would say, in MMA. He's been good, but has sometimes, I think, maybe due to kind of lack of speed and explosiveness, struggled to set up some of his takedowns. But his head mashing, top control game, his front headlock game, all very solid, all very good. The striking, however, it seems to be a thing that he just can't pick up as easily. And a year spent with Mark Henry didn't really yield any noticeable results. At least from where I was sitting, I kind of just saw the same Chris Weidman. He didn't look bad. You can, to his credit, you can say he recovered from the Rockhold loss pretty well. He came in, he was competitive with Romero, but because his wrestling was shut down, it ended up looking a little more like the Rockhold fight. It just kind of seemed that anybody who can shut down Weidman's ground game, or anybody who can pressure him or prevent him from pressuring them, can sort of make him look average on the feet.
Yeah, so we have talked before about the issue of Chris Weidman and athleticism. And as I was rewatching his last couple of fights, I thought, I think he is actually an exceptional athlete. Yeah. I think he's really, really, really fast and really explosive. He's just slow-footed, or kind of heavy-footed, I should say, in much the same way as Jacare is. Where, like, if you're just seeing them move, you're like, oh, man, that guy's not that fast at all. But then the second they do, you're kind of like, oh, holy shit. And
he plods and plods until he explodes.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of forgotten that in his last two fights, because he's facing probably the two most athletic guys in the division, in Romero and Rockhold, and two of the very best athletes in the entire UFC.
And also two of the very best wrestlers in the division.
Yeah, so I think it's easy to kind of forget, like, that in the broader context of the middleweight division, Chris Weidman is a top 5 athlete.
Yeah.
So I've been but still, that there is kind of a hard wall where he's very definitely not one of the best two.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see how, for a guy whose game is predicated on durability and his ability to kind of weather a storm and get inside and out-tough you and kind of out-strength you, that when he can't do that, it's really hard for him. And we saw him try to fight power with finesse in his last fight, and I don't think he has quite enough finesse. I think, is that kind of what you were seeing with regard to the Mark Henry training? Is like he was trying to cut angles, he was moving, he was trying to be lighter on his feet, he was trying to move. But when you try to make a heavy-footed guy fight in a light-footed style, there may be some kind of basic conflict there.
Yeah, maybe it's not a great fit, honestly. I mean, I'm sure they get along. They seem like dudes who would get along, but Mark Henry tends to train a very particular kind of fighter. And maybe Chris Weidman isn't that kind of fighter, but you can also say that doing something different's got to help, because his game, to me, his striking game was seeming pretty stagnant after a while under just Ray Longo, without bringing in some other training. So, yeah, we basically saw a Chris Weidman who I think was, as you said, was trying to be a little trickier, but ended up just kind of looking like Chris Weidman still. You know what I mean? Like, he couldn't execute those things, especially against the fleet-footed Romero. And while Gegard Mousasi may not be the insanely, like, bouncy, mobile, explosive Romero, he can move well. I think he's lighter on his feet than Weidman when he wants to be. And he's got a lot more volume that he produces, especially now. And so will we see, Weidman maybe a little more capable of closing distance, but a little more susceptible to the offense in the early going? And then we have the issue of Weidman's stamina, which I think has always been a question mark for him. He's often faded late in fights, and the defense, even that, he didn't look defensively very good since training with Mark Henry. I think defense and just basically losing the initiative has always been an issue for Weidman, that he's got this great cage-cutting footwork. He's very deliberate. He uses his jab. He throws good short combinations. But when he's pushed back, starts moving in straight lines, throws up his hands and doesn't look to counter. Things really seem to fall apart when Weidman doesn't receive exactly the fight he wants.
Yeah, he has basically no ability to fight off of his back foot.
No.
As close to zero ability to fight off of his back foot as we've ever seen from a fighter at that level.
Yeah. So I think you were saying this, I believe, when we made our round of Styles Make Fights picks last week, but you were kind of expecting Mousasi to take advantage of that and pressure Weidman.
Yeah, I think that Mousasi is going to come out of the gate aggressive. I would expect him to. Not just because that's the right way to fight Weidman, I think, but because it's increasingly been Mousasi's approach. Now, the difference between Mousasi and the last two guys that Weidman has fought, and I keep kind of vacillating on this pick, so I've come around to it again, is that I think Mousasi is nowhere near as physical as those last two guys. And so I think if this is a pure striking matchup, I'll be honest, I think Mousasi is going to carve Weidman up. I think he throws better volume. He's got a better jab. He throws better combinations. He's got better footwork. Like, basically, if this turns into a striking matchup in the middle of the cage or with Mousasi pressuring, Weidman is probably going to lose a decision, a clean, clear decision.
I agree, but
with that said, Mousasi is still not like a monstrous middleweight. No. He's a pretty he's reasonably strong, and he's definitely highly technical, but in terms of raw physicality, I don't think he has the horsepower that Chris Weidman does. And if Weidman can, when Mousasi comes to him, meet him in the clinch or meet him with a takedown attempt, then I think Mousasi is really going to struggle, because if you let Weidman on top of you, he is going to murder you.
Yeah, and to ride that Jacare comparison a little bit, that was the last guy to decisively beat Mousasi. Of course, Jacare had the benefit, being slow-footed burst fighter, he had the benefit of a small octagon. So
sure, yeah.
Weidman is going to have to navigate 750 square feet, where Jacare only had to cut off, what is it, like 580 or something like that, a substantially smaller, maybe? A substantially smaller amount of space in the 25-foot diameter octagon. But Jacare did manage to take Mousasi down 4 times. And I would say Jacare and Weidman are pretty similar in terms of their wrestling ability. If we're just trying to grade wrestling skill, they're both about the same level of effectiveness. So I'm not sure how much that aspect of Mousasi's game has changed. I think he obviously worked on his wrestling a lot during his Strikeforce tenure. Since basically his fight with Mo Lawal, he made very clear improvements to his wrestling, to the point that just a year later he was dominating Ovince St. Preux with wrestling rather than striking with him. And we've seen a lot of that in his UFC career. So he's definitely a better wrestler than he used to be, but the physicality in particular makes it so that competing with guys like Jacare and Weidman, big, strong, explosive middleweights, that is always going to be hard for him.
Well, he's turned into a really, really good open space defensive wrestler. But when you take his space away, when you force him to wrestle and grapple for extended periods against the cage, then his technical edge and speed and ability to find angles disappears. And then when you're in a situation where where Mousasi has to match, strength for strength, that is a battle he's going to lose against most of the elite middleweights in that division.
He even largely lost it against Keith Jardine.
Yeah.
Like making him fight, making him go power against power. That's tough for him. He is, even as he's more aggressive and more dangerous with his hands, he's still more of a finesse fighter. He's still keeping you on the end of his punches. He's still playing tricks on your eyes. That's when he's effective. Even when he's pressuring, he's still more finesse than brute force. And Weidman has both skill and brute force to lean on in the clinch. So it makes it, again, it almost kind of feels like a 2 true outcome fight, where we may very well see portions of both fights, rounds in which Weidman gets a takedown and controls Mousasi or mashes him in the clinch, and then rounds in which Mousasi, as you said, carves Weidman up with his jab and his punch combinations at range. I can very clearly see both of those happening in the same fight.
I think I'm taking Weidman. I just feel like that strength advantage and the ability to grind in the clinch and the ability to hit those takedowns and work from top position, that just seems like too big a deficit, especially if Weidman can get his pressure game going and really force Mousasi backwards. We haven't really seen anybody since Jacare really try to get after Mousasi. And I think if Weidman does that, then it's his fight to lose. He's a slight underdog right now, and there are a lot of caveats about what kind of fighter is he trying to be, and is he abandoning pressure? Those are real questions that you got to ask. But I think if he kind of digs back into his roots, he can make it work.
Yeah, I'm going to take Mousasi. Another split ballot here. But I think what I see is that Weidman, he can create big moments. Of course, he won the title with a big moment. But I think Gegard Mousasi, on the one hand, is more committed to defending and escaping wrestling attacks than he ever has been. right? Where when somebody tries to get in his hips, he's not going to accept guard and try to throw up submissions, which would be a terrible idea against Weidman. It's not impossible that a grappler of Mousasi's skill level could catch Weidman, but it's pretty damn unlikely, right? If Andre Galval could not submit Chris Weidman, then Gegard Mousasi probably isn't going to do it either. But so we have that. We have like all these long pauses. Anytime I make a pick for these fights, but these are such good fights. They're so compelling that it's really difficult to have a clear idea of what's going to happen. But I think that if he can defend the wrestling, and I think that the amount of space he'll have will help, and if he can be aggressive, even in just like 30, 45-second bursts, push Weidman back him into the fence, I think Mousasi's hand speed, his power, his boxing skill will allow him to create moments big enough to negate a lot of the success Weidman does have with his wrestling. And again, I'm actually not convinced that Weidman is as effective a takedown artist as Souza. I know I said they're basically on the same level, but I think, I don't know, Jacare does not get enough respect for his wrestling game, and Weidman, being known as a wrestler, maybe is feared for his takedown game a little too much. Like Anderson Silva was able to stuff his takedowns in their first fight, and I wouldn't say that Anderson Silva's takedown defense is that much better than Gegard Mousasi's, you know?
Oh, I think it is. I think it's certainly been tested more effectively against high-level wrestlers than Gegard Mousasi's has.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, it could also look pretty bad at times because Anderson didn't fight that many high-level wrestlers until the end of his title reign. But yeah, okay. It's tough, man. It's a tough fight to call. I know you've waffled. You were thinking Mousasi last week. I was thinking Weidman last week. We've both flipped positions probably several times. I think Mousasi will get enough time on the feet in this fight and will hopefully be aggressive enough while still maintaining his distance to deny Weidman the opportunity to pressure. And I also suspect that Weidman under Henry may be sort of abandoning the idea of being a pressure fighter, and I don't really like the idea of a Chris Weidman who doesn't press forward because, as we both know, he's just not good when he's retreating and hopping around on the outside. You know, he's not nearly as good as when he's pressing forward. So I think if Weidman tries to angle off against Mousasi and tries to let him come into the clinch, tries to let him come into takedown attempts, if he gives Mousasi the control and the initiative, then with the amount of space in this octagon he has to work, with his advantages in hand speed and volume and possibly stamina, that Mousasi can probably bank 2 rounds. But I do not, however, think that Chris Weidman's chin has suddenly evaporated. I think it would be a mistake to look at his 2 knockout losses and think that he's suddenly no longer durable. I mean, we're talking about 2 of the best chins in the division right here in this fight. So I think a decision is probably in the cards no matter who wins. I don't
disagree with that. God, what a good fight. The top 2 fights on this card. Like, I can understand if there isn't a lot of interest in what's happening down the card. For this fight or for this event, but the top 2 fights, man, are about as good as any you could hope for.
Yeah, I agree, man. I'm very excited for both of them. And we do have 2 other fights on the remainder of the undercard that pique both of our interest. We have the lightweight bout between Will Brooks and Charles Oliveira, and of course the welterweight scrap, Kamaru Usman versus Sean Strickland. We'll take one more break, and when we come back, we will cover both of those interesting contests. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. Will Brooks, Charles Oliveira. We've got the former Bellator lightweight champion trying to get back on the winning track after an unfortunate but understandable loss to a different Oliveira, Alex Cowboy Oliveira, in his last fight. Now he's taking on Charles Oliveira, or as you so aptly named him last week, Pat, Chucky Olives.
Chucky Olives, that's correct.
Moving up from the featherweight division, basically being forced out of the featherweight division after missing the limit for the 4th time. Much like the last Oliveira Brooks fought, This one missed weight by about 10 pounds in his last fight. So now we get Will Brooks probably enjoying the opportunity to fight a normal-sized lightweight rather than a large welterweight. Let's talk really briefly. We mentioned this last week, but let's just sort of recap the loss of Brooks to Oliveira, because both you and I are still extremely high on Will Brooks. We were both very excited when he came to the UFC, but we both harbored some doubts about how easy his path might be back to the title after relinquishing his Bellator throne, because he is, I think we both agree, uniquely well suited to being a 5-round fighter. He's very slick, he's very tactical, he specializes in controlling distance and navigating the space of the cage, and doesn't necessarily create a lot of big decisive moments in his fights. Doesn't necessarily steal rounds so much as he spends the first few figuring out how to decisively control and thus win the rest. And so, given 3 rounds, especially against a big opponent like Oliveira, we don't really get to see the best of Will Brooks. He doesn't have an opportunity to demonstrate what he's really best at. But I don't think, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, I don't think that fight with Alex Oliveira is reason to write Brooks off as a potential challenger to the lightweight throne in the UFC in the near future.
No, especially not because of the way that fight played out. Like, I could have foreseen a scenario in which Brooks doesn't break his rib and grinds Oliveira down into the second and the third round and manages to find a way to pull it out. Like, he was still doing everything he could to stay in that fight despite the injury. And I mean, I don't know, that was just a rough matchup for him regardless. But it also captures kind of the essence of the Will Brooks conundrum, which is that he could go out there and have a competitive fight with Edson Barboza, or I think he could have a competitive fight with Khabib Nurmagomedov.
I think he could beat Khabib Nurmagomedov, but then have a close war with Ross Pearson. You know what I mean?
Yeah. He's just that kind of dude, like, especially when he's in these 3-round fights, because he is a 5-round fighter who relies on cardio and output and kind of layers his game as the fight moves on. Mm-hmm. Like, that 3-round fights are kind of a tough spot for him to be in, and it would behoove him to find a way to get himself into 5-round fights as quickly as possible. So as far as this fight's concerned, I think he's going to blow the doors off of Charles Oliveira. Like, I don't think this is going to be competitive.
Yeah, well, we talked about, I think one of the big things here is Brooks broke his rib against Oliveira and made a really good effort of fighting through an injury that most people who have experienced it say is pretty much impossible to fight through. That a broken rib is just about the worst thing that can happen to you if you're still trying to, breathe and do something physical with any other part of your body. He made a really good effort. And that's kind of the opposite of Charles Oliveira. We talked about Anthony Johnson's tendency to break. Charles Oliveira is one of the other fighters who I think is in many ways defined by his tendency to suddenly crumble in the middle of a fight. We have the Max Holloway fight where, he had a phantom injury that doctors were unable to detect after being strafed with a number of left hands. We have the Cub Swanson fight, which, I've always kind of felt Oliveira sort of felt the shot and decided to be knocked out. We have the Nick Lentz fight, where if Nick Lentz were anything better than a rudimentary striker, he might have stopped Oliveira when he landed a clean right hand in the first round, because Oliveira covered up his face, closed his eyes, and turned his back as soon as he was hit with a clean shot. So Oliveira is in this position of being like an aggressive pressure fighter who likes to scrap with people or who wants to create these engagements, but doesn't really fare that well when the opponents respond well to his pressure. And I think Brooks will probably not have an issue responding to that pressure. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I also think the physicality difference here is huge. Brooks is a pretty good-sized lightweight. He's really strong, very physically skilled. He's a good wrestler. And most importantly, I think he's a really good clinch fighter, and that is where Chucky Olives does, outside of the ground, his best work. If you can shut down Oliveira's clinch game, if you can meet his pressure with pressure, then Oliveira is will really struggle to generate offense. And on the ground, Brooks's grappling has never been the problem.
No.
If Brooks, if if Oliveira thinks he's going to sell out and try to dive on guillotines and things like that to win this fight, yeah, he might catch Brooks. But I think the much more likely outcome of that is Brooks fighting out of the submission, getting on top, and just raining down shots. Like, Brooks is a really, really excellent top control artist, like, and a violent one too. Great elbows, great short punches, knows how to wear you down and wear you out from that position. Like, I have a hard time. I just have a hard time seeing Oliveira's path to victory outside of a flash submission.
So you said this last week too. You kind of expect Brooks to pressure Oliveira a little bit and to mix it up with him. Do you think that maybe because he's not in 5-round fights, that we're sort of going to be experiencing a period of time in which Will Brooks adapts his style overall and becomes maybe more of a boxer puncher than just a pure outfighter, which he really was a pure outfighter in Bellator. Like, he just wanted distance control, pot shotting, all of these little setups and angles from the outside. But since the Ross Pearson fight, we've seen him mix it up with some people on the inside. Do you think that's going to become a thing he needs to do in order to get himself back to the main events and the championship fights?
I think he needs to put more of a stamp on it. Yeah. And that's fine. Like, it must be hard to have been in 5-round fights for as long as Brooks was. I think he had 4 or 5-round fights in a row. To then be back in a situation where you're fighting 3 rounds, where you've kind of got to change your approach. I would imagine your training camps are a little bit different. Like, your points of emphasis have to be a little bit different. You've got to work faster. Like, that could be a difficult adjustment for him to make. But yeah, I think he has the talent to do it.
Yeah,
I absolutely think he has the talent to do it.
We don't really see a lot of fighters in MMA who lose a title and then get back to a title. So we've talked many times about the championship mindset, the champion approach to fighting, the more defensive, controlled, sort of keeping the belt is a style in and of itself. We've not seen many fighters who developed that style perfectly and then had to kind of abandon it in order to get back to that position. I'm not sure we've seen anybody do it effectively, but I really do have faith that Will Brooks can probably do it better than most because he's a phenomenal athlete. I think he's always taken to MMA very naturally. He's technically one of the best boxers in the division right now.
He's also right in his prime. Unlike a lot of dudes that we see lose a title or kind of go on a downturn, that'll happen like 8, 9, 10 years into their career. Brooks has only been fighting professionally for 6 years. He's 30. Like, he's still not the best fighter that he can be. He has room to grow.
Right.
He's at a great camp. He's surrounded by great training partners. I just don't think we're even close to seeing what Brooks can become. Like, of all of the free agent signings that get tossed around, like, I think Brooks is one of the best pickups for the UFC simply because he's not done yet.
He's not. He established. I mean, he established himself as somebody who was going to continue getting better. Where a lot of like big name signees like Hector Lombard, they're established in that they're finished products. Will Brooks is obviously still adapting, still adjusting, still improving, still getting more comfortable in the cage. So I'm looking forward to the fight really just to see Will Brooks. I think having an opponent who will probably try to get after him will give him the opportunity to look good and will give us the opportunity to see what kind of adjustments he can make in this, return to 3-round fights in the middle of his career. So, but both of us like Will Brooks there, correct? You're taking Brooks. What's the method? Let's make it specific.
I think Brooks by late TKO. Brooks by 3rd-round TKO.
By TKO. Interesting.
Yeah, I think he ends this fight standing over Oliveira and just raining down shots.
Yeah, I can see that, actually. Actually, you may be right. I think I was going to take Brooks by decision, but it's Charles Oliveira, man. Chucky Olives does not take punishment well. Oh, I think you might be right. I'm going to agree with you. You've changed my mind. 3rd-round TKO sounds right about right. Okay, welterweights. Kamaru Usman, Sean Strickland. Kamaru Usman, Pat, he's awesome, right? 28 years old, rapidly improving, still coming into his own as a fighter, easily one of, if not the best prospect in the welterweight division. And interestingly, part of, I think, a sort of renaissance of effective top control grapplers and wrestle boxers in MMA. We have like the Mirsad Bektic's and the Khabib Nurmagomedovs, Luke Sanders. There are many guys like this, Brett Johns. We have a lot of fighters like this who are coming up and sort of, I think, reinvigorating the place that cage wrestling has in MMA, in the MMA metagame. Kamaru Usman's one of the best at doing that. Getting his opponents to the cage, controlling them, making them carry his weight, locking down positions while still enabling himself to do lots of damage. He's got a pretty interesting test in his hands, though, in Sean Strickland, who is, like a distance managing, sort of defensively minded, but still dangerous sniper type of fighter.
Yeah, I like this matchup a very great deal. I'm very high on both guys, and it would not surprise me, as high as I am on Usman as a fighter, it would also not surprise me if Strickland won this fight. I think it's a pretty close fight. Mostly because we need to see what Usman can do if he's forced to strike. Like, so far, he's been able to kind of blow through guys, even guys who should have been able, like on paper, to give him a challenge with his wrestling. Nobody has really been able to do that yet.
Yeah.
I think the guy who came closest was probably Leon Edwards, and he still got taken down like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
So, but I think if anybody can do it, it's Strickland. Not just because Strickland is a good defensive wrestler, which he is, but because Strickland is so long and does such a good job of using his reach and making it hard for you to get inside. Great jab, pretty good footwork, does a really good job of staying mobile on the edge of the cage. Not going to give you a lot of opportunities to get inside and fight your fight.
Yeah, and Usman does have the makings of a pretty good striker, but to me, he is very much like a Wilson Hayes, where when his wrestling isn't working, his striking does not look nearly as good. Once he's got his reactions to his takedowns established, then he can let his strikes play off of that. Then he can feel comfortable, I think, being aggressive, letting his hands go. But in a striking engagement with Sean Strickland, I don't think it really works out that well for him. The problem, of course, is that Sean Strickland is one of our most confounding types of fighter, are young veterans who sometimes I think have a different understanding of I say this all the time, I think I said it literally last week, but a different definition of victory in their heads when they fight. And so we often see Sean Strickland and other fighters like him, guys like Jorge Masvidal, go into a fight and they feel like they're winning if they're not being beaten. You know what I mean? Like Sean Strickland, if he's not like Sean Strickland was super confident that he beat Luke Barnett. You know what I mean? Like that fight with Luke Barnett, which was a very close split decision, mostly because Strickland just did not let his hands go. But he felt that because he was not really getting hit by Barnett much, and he was, being pressured and controlled, but not taking damage, he felt fine. And so he didn't feel a sense of urgency to take the rounds from Barnett. And so has he adjusted that in any real way, or is that going to allow Usman, despite the striking disparity, to make this fight his own?
Yeah, that's really the question, right? Who is going to seize the initiative here? Mm-hmm. And if Usman really comes out of the gate and tries to get after Strickland, then I think it's going to be his fight to lose. If he tries to stay a little more measured and lets Strickland start to build some momentum and lets him take rounds, especially the first round, then I think that's going to be tough. Like I think it's going to be Usman's fight to lose, simply because I don't think he's going to give up rounds. I think he's going to take the first 2, and then maybe Strickland is going to find a way to keep him at bay and win the third.
Yeah.
But at some point, we're going to have to see a little bit more out of Usman's striking repertoire. You can see when he throws things, it looks right. Like he has really excellent fundamentals and good technique, but the triggers are just not quite there yet. Like right. He's one of those hyper athletic guys where it looks like they're doing it right, but we haven't quite seen them put it all together.
He's like a more effective version of his teammate Gilbert Burns in that regard. Like I would say his striking is a little more integrated into his game, but not fully. Like he doesn't have a feel for it. Whereas Sean Strickland is like totally the opposite. Sean Strickland, a completely natural striker. We've talked before about fighters with good eyes, but Strickland, it kind of tops that list for me. He's up in the top, 5% of fighters who just have a really good awareness of what's coming at them, even though Strickland is not perfectly technical with his defense. Does a lot of pulling his head straight back and getting his feet out of position, kind of, tries to Muhammad Ali his way out of striking exchanges. He's still extremely difficult to hit clean, especially when he has a reach advantage, because he's extremely aware of what's going on. That's not the case with Usman. So, and because Strickland is actually a pretty powerful striker, I think he's got some deceptive power in his hands, and we've seen Usman get hurt by strikes a few times in the past. So I think I agree with you. It's Usman's fight to lose, but I think it's very possible he could lose it very suddenly at any moment, because any amount of time he spends on the feet is time in which Sean Strickland gets to read him and feel out the rhythm of the fight and build momentum. And I do think Strickland is getting a little better at building momentum. I think he's learning a bit of a sense of urgency. Ironically, he seems to have learned his sense of urgency from Sam Alvey, who is often in his corner these days. But when he was fighting Tom Breese, it was Sam Alvey. He urged him. Sam Alvey knew the fight was close. Something he would never know himself when he's actually in the cage, but he knew it was close, and he said, you have to get after him in this third round. And Strickland did. He went after him. He threw combinations. He got into the pocket. He countered hard. He tried to be more aggressive. And so if Strickland can do that in the second and third rounds of this fight, and if Usman gives him enough time in the first two to get his reads going, then yeah, I agree. I think we could have a surprisingly close fight in our hands, despite the fact that Usman seems to be the guy with the career momentum right now. So that's it for us. UFC 210, a couple of really good fights on the undercard, 2 amazing fights at the top of the card. I am personally looking forward to all of it. It is good to end the drought. It was nice for us to talk about some other topics, but I got to be honest, I'm excited to have a UFC weekend once again.
Yeah, very excited. And this is the first of several in a row. We've got UFC 210 this weekend. The next weekend we have UFC on Fox featuring Demetrius Johnson and Wilson Hayes. Then we have a fight night card, right? Then we have the Lobov Swanson. We got Lobov Swanson, the
real highlight of the year. Screw Conor McGregor whenever he comes back. Forget about the light heavyweight title fight. Forget about John Jones coming back in July. We want to see Swanson versus the T-Rex Lobov. Okay, that's what we want.
Come for Conor McGregor, stay for Artem Lobov.
Jesus Christ. Can we do an episode for that where we just don't talk about the main event because it doesn't deserve it? I think
no, because we got to talk about Cubby Swanson. Yeah. We got to talk about Cubby.
Boy, I hope. I mean, it's not even Artem's fault. But I hope Cub knocks him out.
It's absolutely his fault.
It's not. I mean, if you were given the opportunity, you would take it. I mean, I would have extreme respect if Lobov was like, no, I won't be in the main event because no one cares about me. But
well, see, that's the problem. Apparently, there are people who care about him.
Well,
which is
they care about him by proxy. They would literally care about anyone that Conor McGregor cheered for. So. It is what it is. Sorry for the probably 30% of our audience that does apply to, but a little self-awareness here. Artem Lobov exists as a main event fighter solely because of Conor McGregor.
Let me draw a really important distinction here.
Yeah.
There is nothing wrong with liking Artem Lobov. There's nothing wrong with enjoying him as a fighter. I don't think
I like watching him fight.
Hipsters enough to say that. There's a difference between liking Artem Lobov, enjoying what he does as a fighter, enjoying him as a personality, and thinking that he's really good. Those are two very different things. And I have no time for the latter. I got plenty of time for the former. There are definitely weirder fighters who have fan bases. Rin Nakai comes to mind as one particular example of that. I think it's way weirder to be a hardcore Rin Nakai fan than it is to be a hardcore Artem Lobov fan.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They rank much higher in respectability, and we're talking about Conor McGregor fans here, so that's a real statement. Man, coming up this year, Swanson Lobov. Can you not wait to discuss GSP Bisping?
I'm very excited about GSP Bisping.
You're an evil man. And I say this as
around on it, man. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah, I guess so. All right. Well, that's enough for this. UFC 210 is ahead of us. Let's focus on that for now. We're excited for it. We hope you guys enjoyed our discussion. Before we wrap things up, I want to hear from Pat all of the beautiful pieces and various other history and MMA related works that he is producing this week. What do you got this week, man?
I got 3 articles coming out this week. I have a breakdown of Johnson Cormier 2 coming out on Bleacher Report. That should be up on Tuesday. So by the time this episode is up, it should be out. Coming out on Thursday, I have 2 pieces. I have a GIF-heavy breakdown of Cormier Johnson 2 for the Washington Post. A lot of technical analysis in there. And then I will have my usual preview on also coming out on Thursday. And I think that's it. I think that's all I'm doing this week. What are you doing, Connor?
Let's see. Sherdog preview. I will be doing as well a very technical and in-depth breakdown of Cormier versus Rumble 2. And I don't know if it'll come out this week. I may not have the time, but I am working on a video where I'm studying the defense of Winky Wright. So I know some people care about boxing still, so that's
looking forward to that. Well, and we'll be talking a little more boxing soon too, because we've got Vasily Lomachenko fighting here very soon.
Who, by the way, was amazing, even to see like 15 seconds of him sparring with TJ Dillashaw. Did you see that?
That was awesome. Yeah,
I would so love to see that full round, man. I would pay a lot of money.
I think there was a longer video of it that came out.
Yeah, it was still only like 20 seconds of actual sparring, though. Like, you get to see Dillashaw surprising Lomachenko by landing a hard shot, and then you get to see Lomachenko, like, pressuring Dillashaw and hitting him with, like, 19 jabs in a row. It was good, man. I would love to see more. This is the MMA boxing crossover that I can fully co-sign. I want to see more high-level boxers and MMA fighters sparring with each other.
Yeah, would love to see that. Oh, and also we have Joshua Klitschko later this month.
Of course, yeah. So a lot of good things for combat sports fans coming up this year. And if you guys aren't boxing fans, like, I know we don't get as much attention for our boxing episodes on this show, but it's been a good year for boxing so far, and it doesn't look like it's going to be slowing down. So we have got a lot of various face-punching related topics to cover in the coming months. We hope that you will all stick around and join us for those, and we hope that you all enjoyed this episode as much as I am sure you will enjoy UFC 210. If you want to find us, get into contact with us, Twitter is usually the best way to do that. Send us a message or a tweet or whatever. I am at BoxingBush, B-U-S-C-H. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman. Also, if you are a patron of any amount, $1 all the way up to $300, nobody has given us $300, but no matter how much you've contributed to our Patreon, if you are a patron of ours, send an email to boxingbush@gmail.com from the email you would like associated with your account, and with the username you would like to use. I will get you guys access to our private message board, basically, our private Slack chat, where we've got, now like a couple dozen listeners of the show in there discussing fights and just kind of shooting the shit. So if you are a patron and you're not in there already, and most of you aren't, send that email and I will get you in there as soon as possible. Maybe even, we can get a lot more people in there this weekend to discuss UFC 210 as it plays out live. Otherwise, that's about it for us. Thank you again, guys, for listening. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.